Madam President, senators, deputies, and friends, what a great privilege it is to be here with you this Congreso del Futuro. Much of the Congreso is about the future of science and technology. But what I would like to speak to you about is the future of democracy. For Chile, this is a special moment, a moment that could be a special democratic moment. 40 years ago, Milton Friedman and the Chicago Boys came to tell you how to run your economy. Chile became known as a laboratory for neoliberal free market economics. The results were good in some respects and not so good in others. Rising GDP and economic growth that was very impressive, but also deepening inequality and the erosion of community and solidarity. I come to speak not as an economist, which I'm not, but as a political philosopher. The advice I have to give does not take the form of a fixed model, but instead, it takes the form simply of some questions. What I have to offer is not a recipe to tell you what to do in reforming the Constitution or designing democratic institutions. What I have to offer is simply an invitation to a dialogue about what it means to be a citizen, about what democracy can be in the 21st century, and about what should be the role of money and markets in a good society. The advice I have to offer is not based on the confidence or on the pride or on the hubris of thinking that in my society or in any other society we have clear answers to these questions. To the contrary, I would begin with an observation about the struggles and the troubles facing democratic societies today around the world. In recent decades, we've seen two tendencies in democratic societies. The first is a growing frustration with politics and political parties and politicians. There is a growing lack of trust in established parties and politicians throughout the world. And this is connected, this frustration with politics in democratic societies. It's connected to a certain emptiness in the terms of public discourse. Citizens want public discourse to be about big things, about big questions that matter in their lives, including questions about values and ethics, questions about justice, equality and inequality, about what we owe one another as citizens. People are frustrated with politics today because they sense, rightly, that in most democratic societies, these big questions are not being seriously debated. That's the first tendency. The second is that we in democratic capitalist societies have in recent decades been in the grip of a certain faith. You might call it the market triumphalist faith. The faith consists in an assumption, rarely explicitly defended, an assumption that markets and market mechanisms are the primary instruments for defining and achieving the public good. Now, this faith, this deep assumption about the primacy of markets first found expression in the 1970s and 1980s, including by politicians who were elected to office with this as their explicit ideology. Margaret Thatcher in Britain, Ronald Reagan in the United States. But what's interesting is that even after they passed from the political scene and were succeeded by center-left political parties, this fundamental assumption went unchallenged. The successor parties to the Reagan-Thatcher era moderated this market faith, but in a way they consolidated it by not opening a public debate about where markets serve the public good and where they don't belong. So these two tendencies, the emptiness of public discourse and the citizen frustration with politics, and the unquestioned market triumphalist faith, these two tendencies have not only coincided, but I think they're connected. And I'd like to explain how. In recent decades, we've drifted, almost without realizing it, from having market economies to becoming market societies. The difference is this: a market economy is a tool, a valuable and effective tool for organizing productive activity. But a market society is a place where almost everything is up for sale. It's a way of life in which market thinking and market values begin to dominate every aspect of social life, beyond the domain of material goods. Market values and market thinking begin to dominate personal relations, family life, health, education, the media, law, politics, civic life. That's a market society. And it's not easy to prevent market economies from slipping into market societies. But that's one of our great challenges, or so it seems to me. Now, why worry? Why worry about becoming market societies? For two reasons, I think. One reason has to do with inequality. The more things money can buy, the harder it is to be poor. If money governed access only to yachts and BMW cars and fancy vacations, then inequality wouldn't matter very much. But as money begins to determine access to the essential ingredients of the good life, a good education, decent health care, living in a community without violence, access to political voice and influence, when money begins to govern access to these goods, then inequality matters deeply. So the marketization or the commodification of social life matters in part because it sharpens the sting of inequality. It also matters for a second reason, beyond the problem of inequality. As market values begin to dominate outside the domain of material goods, they have a tendency to erode or corrupt or to crowd out non-market values worth caring about. We can see this by considering a small example. There are some things money can't buy even if it tries. Not many, but some. Consider friendship. Suppose you wanted more friends than you have, and you find it difficult to acquire them in the usual way. It might occur to you, if you had the money, to buy a few. But you would very quickly realize that this wouldn't work. Somehow we all sense the difference between a bought friend and a real one. Somehow we know that the money that would buy the friend dissolves the good we seek. It changes its character. So money can't buy friends, but it can buy many goods to do with social life. And the question is whether it should. So, for example, if you apply the strict logic of the Chicago boys, there is no reason to prevent a free market in kidneys or human organs for transplantation. There is a gap between supply and demand. Thousands of people die every year waiting for an organ. Why not increase the supply by letting people buy and sell kidneys? With kidneys, unlike friendship, if there were a market and if I bought a kidney, the kidney would work, assuming a good match. The fact that I bought it would not destroy the good I seek. So if there's an objection to having a free market in kidneys, or in sex, or in paid pregnancy, or in votes, if there is an objection to buying and selling these things, it can't be that the money will destroy the good I seek. It must be for some further moral reason, which means that in order to decide what goods should and should not be subject to market valuation and exchange, we have to reflect and argue together in public about how to value the goods and social practices we prize. Whether those debates have to do with human dignity and the integrity of the body and the human person, or whether those debates have to do with the meaning and purpose of health and of education and of journalism and of law. What are the questions that we as democratic societies need to debate in order to revitalize democratic life? The first is, how can we keep markets in their proper place? How can we figure out where markets serve the public good and where they don't belong? Why not apply the full market logic of the Chicago boys and have a free market in votes? Many people don't vote in elections. Why not let them choose for themselves whether to sell their votes to people who want those votes? Now, some would suggest we already do that in the system of campaign finance we have, at least in many of our societies. In the United States, the Supreme Court has abolished even the modest restrictions on campaign contributions by companies. And a recent study found that in the current American presidential campaign, over half of all the funds contributed came from 158 families. So we need to debate about how to keep markets and buying and selling in their proper place. But, and here's the second question, how can we do that if the answer to that question depends on controversial ethical questions about how to value social and civic goods? How can we find our way to a public discourse that is more open than we have now to moral questions and, for some, even spiritual questions? How can we find our way to a reasoned public debate with civility and mutual respect, but a reasoned public debate about contested ethical questions? And how can we, for the sake of civility, cultivate the art of listening for the reasons and the principles and the moral convictions of those with whom we disagree? That's not an easy thing to do. But unless we figure out a way to do it, we're not going to be able to find a way to keep markets in their place. Well, that leads to another question. How can these civic habits, the capacity to engage in reasoned public discourse about hard ethical questions, how and where can these habits be developed and taught and cultivated? The answer will have something to do with the system of education. How do we educate young people to be effective democratic citizens? It will have something to do with the media, which today encourages not reasoned public discourse, but shouting matches, where politicians shout past one another. More than this, we need to cultivate this more demanding kind of citizenship. We need institutions within civil society and within local, decentralized forms of political community that can give people practice in governing and reasoning and arguing, so that the only politics is not at the national level, but that national politics arises from debates and arguments and habits that are learned, civic habits that are learned in smaller places. The French thinker Alexis de Tocqueville, was struck by the importance of townships in local government when he visited America in the 19th century. Because he said there citizens can learn the art of government in the small sphere within their reach. But the idea was that those lessons and habits point beyond those small spheres. And so as you debate your Constitution, it seems to me it would be important to debate not only how to draw the electoral districts, not only how senators and deputies should be elected. Those are important questions, questions of representation. But wouldn't it be interesting and hopeful also to debate questions not only of representation but also of participation? How the structure of government might be such that some meaningful power could be exercised closer to where people live and work and care and know one another. A final question worth asking as part of a rejuvenation of democracy is about inequality and why it matters. We hear a lot about inequality, and we debate how exactly to measure it, but we seldom ask why really does it matter? Why care about it? Globally, we recently learned it came to be the case, perhaps for the first time ever, that globally the top 1% in the world own more wealth, as of this year, own more wealth than the bottom 99% combined. All right, but why does this matter? Why should we care about it? Well, for two different reasons. One reason is familiar. Fairness to those at the bottom, fairness to those who live lives of poverty or who lack opportunity. We're familiar with that reason to care about inequality. But there's another reason to care, another kind of damage that inequality does, not just to individuals, not just to the poor, but to the society as a whole and to democratic citizenship. Because if equality is too vast, the gap between rich and poor, it becomes difficult to cultivate a shared common life. The kind of shared common life that enables everyone to say and to know and to feel and to sense that in some respects at least we are all in this together. Democracy needs that. And inequality at a certain point is at odds with that sense of a common life. Let me give you one small example. When I was a kid, I've always been a baseball fan, and I would love to go to baseball games. And when I went to baseball games as a kid in the mid-1960s, going to a baseball game was a class-mixing experience. Some seats were more expensive than others, but not by very much. The cheapest seat was $1. The most expensive seat was maybe $4. The effect was that CEOs and mailroom clerks sat more or less side by side, rooted with passion for the same team, and when it rained, everyone got wet. But then, in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, this began to change, because baseball stadiums and football stadiums more and more were built with VIP palcos, skyboxes, we call them. Now, CEOs and the privileged could sit in air-conditioned comfort far above the crowd in the stands below. The experience of going to a sporting event was less a class-mixing institution, and it no longer was even true that when it rained, everyone got wet. I admit that from time to time, I've had the opportunity to watch a game from a VIP palco, and it's an enjoyable experience. And it wouldn't matter very much if this only happened in sports arenas. But part of what it means to have become market societies is that what's happened with skyboxes and VIP palcos is happening throughout society. Increasingly, as money buys more and more of the good things in life, and against the background of rising inequality, increasingly people of affluence and people of modest means live separate lives. We live and work and shop and play in different places. We send our children to different schools. You might call it the skyboxification or the balconization of social life. This isn't a good thing for democracy, nor is it a satisfying way to live, even for those of us who may be able to buy our way out of public places and common spaces. Here's why. Democracy does not require perfect equality. But what it does require is that people from different social backgrounds, different economic classes, encounter one another, bump up against one another in the course of everyday life. This is how we learn to negotiate and to live with our differences. And this is how we come to care for the common good. And so the question of markets is not, in the end, mainly an economic question. It's really a question of how we want to live together. Do we want a society where everything is up for sale? Or are there certain moral and civic goods that markets do not honor and money cannot buy? Once, Chile was regarded around the world as a laboratory for the neoliberal economic order. My hope is that here in Chile, at this special moment, you will find a way to ask these big questions, create institutions, to cultivate the kind of active, engaged citizens who will make Chile a laboratory for democracy, from which democratic citizens around the world can learn and be inspired. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.